Welcome back, movie buffs. If you have tried watching movies on Prime Video in the last year, then you'd have to agree with me that it is way too hard to find really good movies on Prime Video, but they do have some. In this video, I found 20 of the most underrated movies currently included with Prime Video, and trust me, they were hard to find. This video is sponsored by Sundays for Dogs, but right now I want to start all the way at the back of my list of 20 with a really cool B-level sci-fi movie, NEKROTRONIC. Now this is an Australian production and it's from the same director as Wormwood, which is a wild over-the-top zombie movie. NEKROTRONIC is a wild over-the-top sci-fi flick that has a lot of fun with the genre. Surprisingly, Monica Bellucci has a pretty big role in this. I've always been a fan of her and it's cool to see her doing something that's not serious. And that's what this movie is. It doesn't take itself seriously for 1 second. It just has a lot of fun with this sort of B-level sci-fi genre. Cheesy dialogue, crazy weapons, a plot that gets maybe too convoluted for its own good, but still a wild, fun ride if you're into these types of movies. If you typically don't watch lower budget B movies like this, the NEKROTRONIC is probably not going to be the best place to start. But my number 19 pick is actually a great selection for the art film crowd. The Double is actually based on a book by the same name, and that book actually loosely inspired Fight Club. It also loosely inspired Enemy, starring Jake Gyllenhaal, which was released the same year as The Double. But The Double stars Jesse Eisenberg and follows the story of the book quite closely. And it takes place in this dystopian sort of world that reminded me a little bit of Terry Gilliam's Brazil. Jesse Eisenberg is fantastic. I will say, if you've never really been a big fan of his, this movie might be the one to change your mind. He's doing 2 very different roles and he's doing both of them incredibly well.
What'll it be?
I'll just have a Coke.
A Coke. And you?
Scrambled eggs.
No serve breakfast in the evening?
Well, do you still have eggs here?
Yeah.
And do you have a frying pan?
Yeah.
Then give me the damn food.
All right, my next pick is sort of a Nicolas Cage movie. It actually stars Nicolas Cage and Gina Gershon, but this one is very much like a Lifetime Channel original movie, but it'd be like the greatest one of those ever made.
What are you doing?
They're my babies.
You're sick.
Nikki Wellen stars in this as well, and it's really one of her best starring roles. But she actually becomes a surrogate for this well-to-do family, and it's kind of a twisted thriller. There's actually quite a few twists and turns in this. Again, plot-wise, it's very much like something you'd get from the Lifetime Channel, but with Nicolas Cage and Gina Gershon and Nikki Wellen, they all make it better, and then the twists and turns that occur are pretty phenomenal as well. This is one of those movies where if you're not into the genre, I'm not going to encourage you to watch it, but if I piqued your interest with that description, then Inconceivable is a pretty cool flick. In fact, I could say the same thing about my next 3 picks, and then we'll get into some that have much more broad appeal, but Transit is another low-budget thriller that actually stars Jim Caviezel as a family man on a road trip, but some bank robbers decide to stash all of their cash in his SUV, and then you end up with this really killer road thriller. Think movies like The Hitcher and Joyride. While this isn't really a horror movie, it is incredibly tense, and again, for something at this budget level, it's pretty exceptional. Next up, we've got one of the newest movies on the list and one of the newest additions to Prime Video. It stars Willem Dafoe in Inside. Now, I just recently mentioned this movie on my video summing up everything coming to Prime in September, and this was just added mid-month, but this too will appeal to the art film crowd or just fans of Willem Dafoe. In this movie, he actually plays an art thief who breaks into this swanky New York apartment and then becomes trapped inside when all the security measures lock down. Now, I say it's an art film not just because there's a lot of art-related themes with this movie, but it becomes fairly clear that he could find a way to escape this place. He's locked into an apartment much tighter than is really humanly possible, but it does serve as a pretty fantastic metaphor, and Willem Dafoe's performance carries this thing in a way that I think most other actors would just not have been able to do. My next movie stars Jean-Claude Van Damme, and it's one of the coolest things I think he's ever done. It's called JCVD.
The window didn't explode right. I'm 47 years old, and it's very difficult for me to do everything in one shot.
Now in this movie, he actually plays himself, but he actually becomes the victim in a bank robbery. Yet he's Jean-Claude Van Damme, so some of the other victims are expecting him to do something, and he's actually kind of struggling with whether or not he should, because again, he's just this regular guy, and the movie does a beautiful job of sort of stripping down this persona that he developed in movies over the years, and you get both. You kind of get to see the fandom behind somebody like him, but also kind of the real person. And it too is kind of an artsy movie. It's got a cool look to it. The opening sequence is all done as one shot, so there's some artistic merit to this movie as well. But I will say, if you're just remotely a fan of Jean-Claude Van Damme, you need to see this movie. Again, it is one of the coolest things he's ever done. Alright, my number 14 pick was also just recently added to Prime Video, but it's got some years on it now. However, it is a PG-13 crowd pleaser starring The Rock in Snitch. Now, this is one of the first big action movies that he did before he was really known for doing action movies, and it's a pretty solid one. You've also got a pretty decent role from Jon Bernthal in this. And in this movie, Dwayne Johnson plays a father who actually has to go undercover for the DEA in order to get his son out of jail. For a movie from 2013, it's got a little bit of a slow pace, but once it pops off, it's kind of a fun action movie, really only hampered by its PG-13 rating. Now, for sort of an old school crime mystery thriller, I recommend Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead, starring Andy Garcia, Christopher Walken, and Christopher Lloyd. This too has kind of a familiar setup. There's a heist that goes wrong, but it's got a cool throwback 90s vibe. There's some tracks from Tom Waits that fit really well into this movie. Walken is as menacing as he always is, and Andy Garcia carries the movie. He's really great in this. This is one of his better leading roles as well. This is a solid movie that I highly recommend. It just maybe feels a little cliche here in 2023, but in 1995, it wasn't. But if you want something a little more updated, a little bit more fast-paced, my next pick actually comes from South Korea. It's titled The Man from Nowhere. Now this too has a little bit of a slow pace, even though it starts off with a bang. But in this movie, you sort of follow a John Wick level hitman who develops a relationship with sort of an estranged young girl. It's not nearly as inappropriate as it sounds. It's actually kind of sweet and tender. And then when something happens to her, he just kind of goes on the warpath. Now, this too sounds very familiar, but being from South Korea, it's got a little bit of a different flavor, and it gets pretty wild as things amp up. It does have a lower budget look, but for me, I actually thought that helped this movie. The shootouts and the violence all feels kind of wild and realistic because it doesn't have this glossy, polished look to it. If you've been digging crime movies from South Korea at any point over the years, The Man from Nowhere is an exceptional one, but I've got another one way closer to the number one spot on this list. Next up, we've got the last movie on my bottom 10, and then we'll move on to my top 10. But Observe and Report stars Seth Rogen, Ray Liotta, Jesse Plemons, Michael Pena, Anna Faris. It is a killer cast, but it doesn't feel like a typical Seth Rogen movie. His character doesn't feel like a typical Seth Rogen character, and that's because this was written and directed by Jody Hill, who mostly collaborates with Danny McBride on a lot of his movies and shows like Eastbound and Down and The Righteous Gemstones. So if you like that brand of humor, I highly recommend Observe and Report. It's dark, it's dirty, and it's really funny for anyone who's into dark humor. If you are not, there's a very good chance you won't find any of Observe and Report funny. Now, before moving on to the top 10, I want to introduce you to my dog, Peanut, because today's sponsor, Sundays for Dogs, actually saved Peanut's life. Now, even though she looks like a puppy, she is pushing 18 years old, which is pretty old for a dog like this. And unfortunately, about a year ago, she just stopped digesting her food, and we thought we were giving her good food, but I switched her to Sundays and everything changed. She started digesting the food better, she was happy to gobble it up and eat it again, and she is still with us today as a result. And that's because Sundays is air-dried dog food that's actually 90% human-grade meat, meaning meat safe for you and I to eat, and 10% vegetables. And because it's air-dried, there's no messy prep, you just dump it in the bowl like kibble, yet it's packed with way more nutrients than typical dog food. And Sundays can deliver this premium dog food right to your front door for 40% less than a lot of other brands because they're not having to concern themselves with refrigeration or anything like that. They're just focused on this short list of quality ingredients. And my viewers can save an additional 35% off of that when they go to sundaysfordogs.com/flick. That link is also in the video description below. That's 35% off an already great deal. Sundays really is a simple, convenient, and affordable way to take better care of your dog. But speaking of great stuff, let's talk about the top 10 movies on this list. My next pick also comes from South Korea, meaning you will have to read subtitles. And this one is fairly slow paced, but if you're a patient viewer, the payoff in Burning is amazing. This actually stars Steven Yeun in one of the greatest roles I've ever seen him in. I'm a fan of his. He's incredible in this movie in more ways than one. But above all else, you do need to be patient. In fact, if I were to tell you what this movie's really about, it would spoil everything. But it's an incredibly well-written, slow-paced thriller that has some twists and turns not only did I not see coming, but they were also subtly different from anything I'd seen before, making this movie just feel incredibly fresh. This is one I've highly recommended since it released. If you're a fan of some of the dramas from South Korea, Burning is one of the best I've seen in years. But if you don't like that slow pace, you just want to watch some people cracking heads, my next pick is going to scratch that itch with Avengement.
You must be a tough guy then, yeah? Chasing that bloke away all by yourself. It's funny that. You don't look like a tough guy to me.
Well, what's a f***ing tough guy look like then?
Well, they look like me, don't they? You know, handsome, well-aged.
Scott Adkins is a longtime stuntman. He was just recently in John Wick 4. I loved the scene with him in it, and Avengement is easily my favorite movie of his. In fact, I think his character in John Wick was modeled after this one a little bit. But in this movie, he plays a once ordinary man who has been hardened, as hardened can be, by the prison system, and he escapes for the sole purpose of going to a pub in London to exact revenge on a whole gang full of people. It's kind of like a Guy Ritchie movie in a lot of ways with the dialogue and the setting of this English pub, but it's also an all-out brawl martial arts movie with plenty of incredible fight choreography and violence oozing out of every orifice in this movie. But like I said, the dialogue is fun, it's quippy, it's interesting. Scott Adkins gives an incredible performance in this movie. I love every stitch of it. If you love Guy Ritchie movies or martial arts movies, I think you're gonna really like Avengement. If you love both genres, this is gonna be your new favorite movie. But my number 8 pick on this list is easily the lowest budget movie on the entire list. But even though they didn't spend much money on Coherence, it still has kind of a Christopher Nolan-esque plot. In this movie, you follow a group of people just having a basic dinner party, but there's a comet flying overhead that night, and weird things start happening. Now that setup should be interesting enough for most of you to get past some of the obvious budget restraints, but the plot and the storyline is way more in-depth and involved than I'm leading on. It's actually incredibly complicated and deals with a lot of theoretical things, and it actually comes across really well, considering that for the most part, everything's just delivered by these actors and what they say with little to no actual special effects or visual cues on screen. This movie has really developed into a cult classic over the years where some folks just absolutely love it. I've yet to see anyone come across it that hasn't at least enjoyed it. Now I've got another foreign language thriller on this list, but this one actually comes from France and is titled Tell No One. In this movie, a man's wife disappears, and just as he's beginning to maybe get over it and move on with his life, he receives information that she may not be dead, and the movie really just pops off from there. There's a lot of running, a lot of cat and mouse stuff. Obviously, there's dialogue where you're gonna have to read subtitles, but there's also big sections of the movie where there's basically no dialogue. This is actually based on a best-selling novel, and it's the type of movie that they would remake with Liam Neeson. I'll say if you're a fan of Liam Neeson movies, Tell No One is pretty excellent, but even if you're not, this is still a solid thriller from France. Now, my number 6 pick is a somewhat recent release that will make a fantastic watch for some of you during Halloween, which basically the Halloween season has already started, but this really is going to be more for the art film crowd, Bones and All.
Dad!
You didn't. When the cops get here, you have to be good and gone.
I can't help
help you anymore. I know it's not your fault. You were born this way.
Now this actually stars Timothée Chalamet as basically a vampire, not quite. He's actually a cannibal, and the way that this movie plays out feels very real and authentic, meaning there's a supernatural element at play, yet it's not really amped up. It doesn't feel quite like movie stuff. It feels almost like it's really happening. And you actually follow him and a young woman, who's actually the main character in the movie, trying to make their way across the country and survive as these bloodthirsty cannibals. Again, very, very akin to vampires, yet this movie has stunning cinematography. Their love story is sort of beautiful, and it's got this slow pace to it. The movie itself is definitely inspired by Terrence Malick's The Badlands, which actually starred Martin Sheen. That's a fantastic art house movie, and so is Bones and All, yet it's got this really creepy element to it as well. It's violent and extremely bloody at times, but it's not pervasive throughout the entire story. So if you like artsier films like this one, again, this is gonna make an amazing watch leading up to Halloween. My next pick might also make a decent October watch, yet it's really not a horror movie at all. Light of My Life, starring Casey Affleck. This movie is actually much more akin to The Road. It takes place in a post-apocalyptic landscape, or at least if it's not an apocalypse, society has collapsed. There seems to be like no government or anything, and he and his teenage daughter are just trying to survive in the woods, in abandoned houses, out in the snow. This too has a very slow pace, but it's incredibly well done. There are several sequences in the movie that are very intense, and ultimately I think the messages and everything hit home pretty well, and it's not nearly as depressing as The Road. But my next pick is the newest movie on the list, and it's the movie I've had maybe the most fun watching in all of 2023, Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves.
Were you killed in the Battle of the Everhorse?
Yes.
4 more questions, right?
Yes.
Did that count as a question?
Yes.
Damn it. Only answer when I talk to you, okay?
Yes.
Why did you say okay at the end of that?
I didn't.
Fantastic. Where's the shovel?
Now, full disclosure here, I am not a Dungeons & Dragons guy. I've never played it. My only real knowledge comes from pop culture and movies and TV shows. Furthermore, I had no expectations for this movie. It just didn't look like my kind of thing. I like Chris Pine. I like Michelle Rodriguez. They're not always great in my opinion, but Dungeons & Dragons was such a surprise. It's actually an incredibly funny movie. I would say if you love Guardians of the Galaxy, maybe more than a lot of the other Marvel movies, you're absolutely gonna love Dungeons & Dragons. You don't have to know anything about it to enjoy this movie. This was actually directed by John Francis Daley, who you might recognize from Freaks and Geeks. He was a little kid in that show. But he also directed Game Night, another movie that I think is just incredibly funny, one of the funnier movies to have come out in the past 10 years, in my opinion. And Dungeons & Dragons has a similar sense of humor. It never takes itself too seriously, and most of the humor and the setup and the set pieces are pretty clever as well. Hugh Grant has an amazing role in this as well. It's just a real fun time at the movies. If you passed on it because it just didn't seem like you, but again, you love Guardians of the Galaxy, make it the first movie you watch off of this list, trust me. I told you we were getting into some bangers. My number 3 pick is one of my favorite hidden gem thrillers to recommend since long before I started doing this on YouTube. Running Scared, starring Paul Walker. This movie's loaded with more style than you can shake a stick at. Paul Walker actually has a pretty fantastic performance in this. He has to carry the movie and do a lot of different things as an actor, and he actually kind of kills it. And this movie pops off from the very beginning. The first 6 minutes are pretty fantastic in the movie. If you're not into it by then, you're probably not going to be into the whole movie, but if you love that opening sequence, trust me, you're going to absolutely love this flick. Hopefully I'm turning quite a bit of you on to this movie who have never seen it. That's what I love to do on this channel. If that happens, some of you, let me know in the comments. I still do read them. Which is a good point to mention. If you like getting movie recommendations like this, why not let the algorithm know by clicking that like button and maybe clicking the subscribe button. That way you at least have a chance of seeing my content again in the future. But my number 2 pick, believe it or not, is a documentary. And not only is it a documentary, it is a very low budget one that was done almost completely independently. And it's also one of the most heartbreaking stories I've ever seen on film. Dear Zachary. Now, the backstory with Dear Zachary is that the father of a young child named Zachary dies, and his best friend decides to make a film about the father so that one day young Zachary can see it and know who his father was. That setup is heartbreaking enough, but what he uncovers while he's making this documentary that's just about his friend, for his friend's son to see, it's really not for us to see. He discovers some horrifying truths about what actually happened to his friend, and as horrifying as those things are, the story just continues to turn into this almost endless rabbit hole. It is shocking, it's wild, it's upsetting, and it's all true, and it all plays out as this guy's trying to make this documentary. It's one of the most incredible sort of true crime documentaries I think I've ever seen. If you somehow have never seen this gem and you like that genre, make it the first thing you watch off of this list. But now we're at my number 1 spot, and I mentioned I had another South Korea thriller closer to the number 1 spot, and that's because it is my number 1 pick. I Saw the Devil. Now, this is one I recommend often on the channel, but I don't always see it available on streaming, and Prime Video just recently added it. This is kind of a mashup of a serial killer hunt movies like Silence of the Lambs, yet there's a lot of martial arts in this one as well. However, they feel fairly grounded. They don't feel over the top or forced. It doesn't feel like a fight movie. It is just a dark, tense thriller that has ultimately a setup that is so different from anything else in this genre, and not only does it work, but it's oddly satisfying for it to be such a dark movie. I'm not going to spoil what it is, but man, is it cool, and man, does this movie hold up. I know it's got a cult following. This is another one, if you've yet to discover it and I'm just turning you on to it, you're going to be pleasantly surprised with how solid of a flick it is. But that is the list. Thanks again to Sundays for sponsoring another video. Don't forget to check out their link in the description. But I will keep making these videos as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special Prime Video episode, and you will see me on the next one.